Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind Headlines. And in this programme tonight, we shall be marking Israel's 76th anniversary as an independent nation state in fulfilment of biblical prophecy. Sadly, due to the horrors of October the 7th and the national trauma that Israel is going through, this year's celebrations have been very much subdued, with the normal annual flypast that the Israeli Air Force fly over Tel Aviv and Herzl has been cancelled this year. Many of the fireworks has been cancelled as the nation mourns the death of those 1,200 civilians that were murdered by Hamas on October the 7th. Also, concerns about the plight of the hostages and the ongoing war against Hamas in Gaza has meant that this year's celebrations have been very much muted. However, this doesn't take away from the fact of God's faithfulness to the nation of Israel and how Israel has been redeemed from the nations around the world as the Jewish people have come back home in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So we'll be asking, where is Israel at 76? Reagan, it almost seems like an annual event to cover Israel's anniversary, and particularly as we remember that this year is Israel's 76th anniversary. But I think from Israel's 75th to Israel's 76th anniversary, we've seen that there's been deep pain, deep anguish, and probably one of the hardest years in Israel's history is the magnitude of the horrors of October the 7th has actually come to light. And this is why, for example, the Israelis are very muted in their celebrations of what is known as Yom Ha'atzmaut in Hebrew, which is Independence Day, knowing that this is a day of celebration, but it's more of a somber day as the nation reflects on the horrors that occurred on October the 7th.
It's been very difficult, Simon, and even we've talked about how last year's celebration, 75 is generally a big number, but it was similarly muted because of all of the social unrest. We were even talking last year and speculating, was Israel on the verge of civil war? Certainly there were people within Israel who felt that it was, with various individuals high up in the IDF and Israeli Air Force stepping down and saying that they were not going to be involved under this current incarnation of government. And yet October the 7th galvanized the nation in many ways. It healed a lot of the divisions. People saw we need to have unity, not division at this point. The internal disagreements and issues we have, those must take second and third, fourth place to the priority now to protect our national security against the threat of the terror group Hamas in the wake of the atrocious attacks on 7th of October.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking there about the controversial judicial reform proposed by the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, which is also the most religious and conservative government ever in Israel's history. And knowing that so much of Israelis, particularly those who live in the coastal plains such as Tel Aviv, Herzl and Netanya, that area are pretty much a kind of secular in their viewpoint. You go to Jerusalem and of course it's very religious there. And it's like two Israels existing in the same country. And of course, we saw that over the judicial reforms, the huge protest that occurred last year that literally was tearing the nation apart. But I think after October the 7th was this realization amongst Israelis that, look, we can't afford to have these debates. We can't afford to look at this as being an existential threat when we have Hamas in Gaza and knowing what Hamas committed on October the 7th, Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis. Also on our doorstep is a resurgent ISIS, and also then the Iranian regime is also stoking the fires of war and the terror organization. So I think Israel has sadly woken up to the reality that she's in the Middle East, that Tel Aviv, however much it's on the coastline, is not immune from the rest of the Middle East. And this is, I think, very much shaping kind of this year's celebrations.
It very definitely is, Simon, and what we're going to see, I think, in coming days is definitely that kind of patriotism that to some degree felt like it was waning a little bit last year over some of these internal controversies. Restored, people showing the flag right and left. Of course, you can go to any place in Israel now and flags are everywhere. in a way that I've never seen over the years that I've gone. The people love their nation, regardless of where they stand in regard to the religious and social political issues. They're there with Israel and for Israel. And increasingly, people are also waking up to the reality that the existence of Israel, maybe they've taken for granted at times, but this is actually something they have to hold on to and fight for, something that they have to remain vigilant lest it disintegrate or come under increased threat.
Also, the other thing, I think Israel, as Israel is now 76 years old as an independent nation state, Reagan, is the fact that we're seeing huge tensions between the government of Benjamin Netanyahu and also the Biden administration in the States over the handling of the war. And the fact is now that we're seeing the huge diplomatic and military pressures being placed upon Israel, not so much in terms of military attack, but in terms of holding back a rearmament and the weapons needed to destroy Hamas in Gaza by the Biden administration, and a total disregard for Israel's security here, but also a kind of complicit support for Hamas, effectively, that if Israel is not able to finish the job in Rafah and to destroy the last battalions of the Hamas terrorists that are there, as well as Palestinian Islamic Jihad, then Israel's very survival then is threatened, and Hamas poses that existential threat, and that Israel can't afford to have Hamas in Gaza any longer. But of course, we're seeing that the Biden administration views differently on this, and so we're seeing the big tensions here. But I suppose the most important thing is we look back at the past 76 years, we see what other nation has been reborn as a nation again. What other nation has had a language such as Hebrew that's been dead for ever since the kind of destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70 has actually come alive again, and a people have come alive again. And so you can't take out, when you look at Israel, the prophetic significance of this country, its importance to God, and yet we see today Israel at 76 is the focus, the news story that is dominating world headlines around the world.
When I was recently there, Simon, something that kept coming to me was reflecting on various sites. The Philistines were a powerful nation, powerful civilization. Even I remember an article a couple of years ago in the Times that was trying to say, we've gotten the Philistines all wrong. They were highly advanced and wonderful people. And I looked out over the land of Philistia from the ruins of Gat, where Goliath was from. And I was thinking through all of the names of those ancient Canaanite civilizations that were functioning, that were there, the Jebusites, the Girgasites, the Hittites, you have the Edomites over closer to Jordan, you have, of course, the Philistines. None of these nations remain. And I was struck and reminded of the prophecies. These individuals, these peoples still were around during the days even of the exile into Babylon. But God says very, very clearly throughout the prophets that their cities will become rubble heaps, that they will not remain, that jackals will live in the houses in which they once inhabited. And here I'm thinking, these civilizations ruined, and yet still here we have the Jewish people. We still have a reborn Jewish nation state. 76 years old, one of the graphics I've seen says 3,000 years young. So it's an amazing testament to God's promises, His enduring love and faithfulness.
No, absolutely, particularly if we look back to the 19th century when this was a kind of barren land. You had the likes of Mark Twain, who visited Israel in the 1860s, said that he hardly saw any soul. He didn't see any trees, and would walk 15 miles before he saw one tree. Saw nomadic people, but in terms of a nation, it was barren, it was desolate. We also see, for example, in the north where we have now the Carmel region around there, and the Megiddo Junction and the whole Jezreel Plain, that was all swampland, even as far as up into the 1920s, about 100 years ago. And so the development and the speed of the nation of Israel, how it's developed over the past 76 years, been extraordinary. I mean, Israel, for example, their only export after Israel's war of independence was oranges. And now Israel's leading the world in a high-tech innovation, startup nation, and is an economic, political and military powerhouse in the Middle East. And no one would have thought that 76 years ago. But sadly, yesterday was a very somber day in Israel called Yom Ha'atzmaut. And this is a day that Israel remembers the fallen soldiers, both men and women, who served and fought in Israel during her 5 wars and other previous wars against terrorist organizations, whether it's Hamas, the PLO, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. These are the soldiers that gave their life in defense of the state, plus also those who were victims of terrorism were also read. I've been in Israel for Yom Ha'atzmaut, and it's very moving. I mean, you just turn on Israeli television and literally you just see a somber classical music being played, and you see names of those who have fallen defending the state of Israel. It's a very somber day, and it's incredible how Israel can go from that somber day of remembering the show of the Holocaust to honouring the fallen dead who served in the IDF to the celebration of Israel's rebirth on its Independence Day.
It's a testimony as well as to how independence is always something that's hard fought. And the nation recognizes that before it reaches a place of peace and prosperity, there's had to be the sacrifice of many. And there remains the sacrifice of many, as on this particular Yom Ha'atzmaut, observed on a Monday, the 13th of May. Yes, they are remembering the fallen soldiers of previous wars and conflicts, but they were also remembering those murdered by Hamas on October the 7th, some 1,200 murdered by Hamas on that horrible day, with hostages still in captivity. How many alive, how many dead, the exact numbers are unknown. The death also of 272 soldiers since the launch of that IDF ground offensive into Gaza with the goal of destroying Hamas. Israel Hayom reports under the headline, Israel remembers its fallen victims of terror as Memorial Day begins. It says since the previous Memorial Day, 760 more fallen soldiers have been added to the tally, including 711 who fell during October 7th and Operation Iron Swords. Over 23,000 soldiers and over 3,000 civilians have been killed since 1860, when the Jewish people started to come back to their ancient homeland.
Extraordinary. I mean, what's extraordinary is that 711 IDF soldiers belonging to the Israeli Defense Force perished at the hands of Hamas. And having seen those videos, some of them literally died the most horrific deaths at the hands of Hamas. And it's something that Israel is even prepared to release thousands of prisoners for one Israeli hostage like they did with Gilad Shalit. And it just remembers how much the whole ethos of the nation of Israel is one of celebration of life and the preservation of life and human dignity compared to Israel's enemies who embrace death. We have an excellent CBN news report now that looks at Yom Ha'atzmaut, where the Israeli Prime Minister addressed the nation on what is and was a very somber day as Israel remembers those fallen fighting in Israel's wars during the past 76 years.
Israel paused for 2 minutes this morning as the nation commemorated its Memorial Day. At the opening ceremony, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised to continue the Gaza operation and declared what wounded soldiers from the war have told him.
All of them without exception, even the amputees, they told me the spirit of the people lifts them up. Keep going until victory, and that's how we will do it. The spirit of the people, with God's help, will continue to lift us up in the fateful challenges that are still ahead of us and that we had in our 76 years of independence.
More than 300,000 Gazans have already fled Rafah. Some have escaped to safe zones established by the Israel Defense Forces to get them out of harm's way. Israeli forces have pushed deeper into the city, the last major stronghold of Hamas. So far, they're using targeted strikes without launching a major invasion. This may address President Biden's threat to halt American weapons shipments to Israel if it does undertake a major assault. Israel also pounded northern Gaza, where some Hamas terrorists have fled and regrouped after the IDF cleared that area months ago. At the same time, Hamas has continued to fire rockets at southern Israel, including one that struck a playground in the southern Israeli city of Beersheba. According to the Washington Post, the Biden administration offered to share intelligence about where Hamas leaders are located if Israel holds back on a major attack on Rafah. Some Israeli analysts question why the U.S. wouldn't share such vital intelligence anyway with its strongest ally in the Middle East. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken delivered some of the strongest U.S. criticism yet of Israel's conduct of the war.
Going into to Rafah, even to deal with these remaining battalions, especially in the absence of a plan for civilians, risks doing terrible harm to civilians and not solving the problem, a problem that both of us want to solve, which is making sure Hamas cannot again govern Gaza.
But Republicans and many Democrats are pushing back hard against the president's actions on withholding weapons for Israel. Representative Michael McCall from Texas said an invasion of Rafah is necessary to complete Israel's mission.
For us to step in and say, no, you can't go into Rafah and finish the job, I think it's tantamount to an arms embargo. It's also very similar for us to say in World War II, hey, like my dad's generation, you can invade all the way up to Berlin, but you can't go into Berlin to finish the job.
Despite the White House's actions, Israel is promising on the eve of its 76th Independence Day to push ahead until Hamas is finally defeated. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
So on this Yom HaZakaron and the Memorial Day for those fallen, we remember those who continue to give up their lives for the land. Also, we reflect on how it is in many ways, fighting yet again for its independence and its security as a nation. Now, Douglas Murray has reflected on the heroes of October the 7th, and there's a speech that was reprinted in the New York Post under the headline, "I witnessed Israel choosing life as it fights against a death cult." Douglas Murray says, "I've never seen as much of the best and the worst of humankind as I have in the past 6 months in Israel and Gaza. I was here in New York on the 7th of October, and on the 8th I went down to Times Square. And there were these men and women waving signs celebrating the massacre. They were holding these signs in Times Square by any means necessary. I thought I had to get to Israel as soon as I could, that we were going to see a kind of Holocaust denialism in real time, and therefore I should see with my own eyes everything that had happened. In Israel, I joined the pathologists in the morgues of Tel Aviv as they were trying to identify the dead, an unbelievable task which they do with extraordinary delicacy and religiosity. I had the great opportunity to witness firsthand Israel's response, because unlike some countries today, Israel doesn't just sit back with equanimity when it's attacked. Some of the world would like it to do so. Seeing one of the fences that the terrorists broke into, I thought, people aren't going to realize the scale of this. This was a 4,000-person, battalion-sized terrorist attack that aimed to go all the way up the center of the country. What do I make of all this? I think often of the line from Deuteronomy when God says, I've set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that you and your descendants might live. Because when I think of the 7th now, I don't only think of the victims.
It also goes on to say, quite incredibly, that I think of the extraordinary heroes There's a young man who's a friend. He's in his 30s. He woke up in Jerusalem, realized the seriousness of what was going on, got into his car and drove south, collected some guns, left a farewell message to his children and his wife on his phone, and then got a call from his company commander on the road saying, you have to come back to base in Jerusalem. And his response was, no, we're needed in the south now. And his battalion commander said, are you defying an order? He said, yes, we are needed in the south, as he fought for the next 48 hours and survived. I think of my friend Moshe, who noted that he had a bullet mark down the top of his helmet. And so what we saw on October the 7th, and this is what Douglas Murray so articulately is able to convey, the incredible heroism of some people, some Israelis who literally put their life in the line to save others. And thankfully, there is a Middle East report I did with an amazing former IDF paratrooper called Ophir. He's also a paramedic with MDA, and that's on a recent Middle East report sharing his experience of helping to protect people on October the 7th in Sderot, right next to the Gaza Strip. And you've got footage there of literally 5 or 6 Hamas terrorists with RPGs and guns shooting at him. And yet, because of his military training and obviously God's protection, he was then able to avoid being killed on October the 7th, helped rescue many people, and set up a field operations center in Sderot to rescue the injured. So, I mean, there are so many question marks as to why it took the IDF so long. And when we were in Israel last in January, speaking to our security guard, who was also quite high up in the IDF, he said that the Israelis were concerned that if they flew into the south of Israel with the helicopters, that they would be shot up by RPGs. And so it took the Israelis 6 hours to get down on the scenes. But that doesn't take away from the courage shown by so many Israeli heroes that they put their life on the line to rescue their fellow Israelis who were being murdered by Hamas, the biggest massacre we've seen since the Holocaust.
Murray talks about how his friend whose helmet was hit by the bullet thankfully had survived after killing 3 terrorists with his gun he carries with him. He then speaks of the extraordinary people of the Hatzalah, the first responders unit, and particularly of how the head of the organization in 30 years of doing the job said that the whole 30 years together wasn't like 1 minute that morning. The lights just went off everywhere. I think of a young woman who was 23. She was a beautiful girl, a photographer. She decided she had to go and re-enlist. Her parents begged her not to, but she said she had to. She was killed on her first day by a rocket that landed on her in Sderot. In a letter she left for her parents, she said how sorry she was. But she said, I wanted to live life, and now I want you to live it for me. And then he thinks finally of the extraordinary evening in November last year. He says, I was at the Schneider Children's Hospital when the helicopters came, returning the first hostages. The first children who Hamas has stolen from their homes in the south. But when the helicopters emerged in the night sky, the people of Tel Aviv realized what was happening and every car stopped. I noticed there was applause from the citizens, the Tel Avivians, and then there was singing all the way through the streets of Tel Aviv. They were singing, Haveinu Shalom Alachem, we brought you peace. Now there's millions of stories like this across Israel. The country rings with them, it resounds with them. Absolutely. The thing is, perhaps it does require life to become serious again. Perhaps the students that we see at these destroyed universities, perhaps they just need a dose of reality someday. I always pray that that day never comes to them because it'll be the biggest wake-up call anyone has ever had. But all I would say is that any country should be so lucky as to have a young generation like that in Israel.
And he sums up his very powerful speech by saying this. They were weighed in the balance since October the 7th, and they've been found to be magnificent. What Israel has been up against is not just a people of death, but a cult of death, a cult which wishes to annihilate an entire race, and which after dealing with that race has made it very clear what it wants to do with Christians. Everyone in Britain, everyone in America, I want to dedicate my acceptance of this award to the people of Israel who in the face of death choose life. And that's incredible. I think he sums up something. And I'm a big fan of Douglas Murray, and I have spent time with him, and I met him on quite a few occasions, and very nice, very humble, probably the most articulate man I've ever came across in my life, and the books and the articles he writes are absolutely extraordinary. But his love for the Jewish people and for Israel is absolutely unquestionable. And I think he sums up the difference between Israel and her enemies, particularly Hamas, that Israel chooses life whilst Hamas choose death. And this is the battle that Israel's in. It's a battle of life and death.
And in light of this time of memorialization of those who have fallen, there's also, at the same time, muted though it may be, the celebration of Independence Day. And what we're seeing is indication of the people of Israel, while mourning those who are fallen, also recognizing that because of those who are fallen, they're able to enjoy the freedoms that no one else across the Middle East has. And this is incredibly significant. Jeffrey Leste, writing in the Philadelphia Jewish Exponent under the headline, "From Remembrance to Independence, Israel Prepares for Mourning and Celebration Amid Ongoing War," comments, "How do they do it? I've always been in awe of Israel's ability to transition from the very somber Yom HaZikaron, Day of Remembrance for Israelis fallen in battle and terror attacks, to the following day's Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day celebrations. On Yom HaZikaron, the entire country slows down, with somber music played on all radio stations, solemn remembrance ceremonies taking place at cemeteries across the country. You can feel the sadness in the air of remembering loved ones whose lives were cut short. A siren goes off, and for one short moment, the entire country stands together in silence in remembrance of those we have lost. And then with nightfall, almost as if with the flicking of a switch, the sadness is tucked away and the party begins. Fireworks, barbecues, picnics, concerts, beach parties galore, all in celebration of another year of Israeli independence. Another year that the miracle of Israel, birthed out of war, tribulation, and a 2,000-year yearning to regain the ability of being a people in control of its own homeland, has survived. Yet this year's observance of Yom HaZikaron and Ha'atzmaut will be unlike any other. For many in Israel, every day since October the 7th has felt like a Yom HaZikaron. Many Israelis have stopped saying Boker Tov, the ubiquitous good morning greeting. Instead, provide a grudging Boker morning in its place. How can there be a good morning when loved ones and friends are fighting a war and hostages have yet to be returned from Gaza? For many, though the public calendar may indicate that it's spring and time to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut, their own personal calendar and sense of time is stuck at October 8th. What is a country, a people supposed to do when they're stuck in remembrance and feel that their very independence is on shaky ground?
And then he finishes the rest of his article with this. It says, the Israeli national anthem, which is known as the Hatikva, the hope. As a people, we know that despite the endless tragedies, we will endure, survive, and even thrive as a people. We are forward-looking people who have never lost hope. The fact that after 2,000 years of wandering, Israel was able to come into existence is not to be taken for granted. Not to celebrate this miracle, even our lifetimes, despite the current situation, is to provide our enemies with an undeserved victory. And so, despite the war, still unfolding tragedy of October the 7th, we will celebrate this year's Yom Ha'atzmaut, be it a bit more subdued, and look to the future with hope. So let's have a look at this brilliantly produced video made by the International Christian Embassy in Jerusalem to mark last year's 75th anniversary. But it gives us a kind of prophetic overview of God's plans and purposes for the nation of Israel as the Israeli people celebrate 76 years as an independent nation state in fulfillment of biblical prophecy.
Israel has a story unlike any other. From the time the Israelites first settled in the land and throughout centuries of exile and war, Israel was to eventually re-emerge as a nation. Jewish exiles began their return to Israel in the late 1800s, and over 3 million Jewish immigrants have come from more than 120 nations since Israel was re-established. The Hebrew prophets spoke of this day when the Jewish exiles would be restored to the land of Israel. For I will take you from among the nations, gather you out of all countries, and bring you into your own land. Before officially being declared a state, Israel already had its own national orchestra, the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra, its own university, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, its own research center, the Weizmann Institute of Science, and its own hospitals, such as Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. Israel's founding leader, David Ben-Gurion, said that this land was the birthplace of the Jewish people. The prophet Isaiah spoke long ago about the revival of the Jewish nation in their ancestral homeland in our day. Shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion was in labor, she gave birth to her children. Israel was officially reborn as a nation on May 14, 1948. But the nation's rebirth also came amid birth pangs. Modern Israel was established just 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, when over 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Then, as Israel declared its independence, the nation had to fight off 5 invading Arab armies. Remarkably, Israel repelled these attacks, and in 1967, Israeli troops recaptured the beloved city of Jerusalem from Jordanian hands. The Psalms speak of Israel's rebirth as a great dream that would finally be realized, and it would fill the Jewish people with great joy. When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with singing. Over the decades since, Israel has built upon that dream by overcoming many obstacles and by entering into peace accords with neighboring Arab countries. Both before its statehood and afterwards, Israelis began to cultivate the desert, and through their efforts, over 300 million trees have been planted since 1901. Israel is now a vibrant democracy in the Middle East, promoting free speech among its citizens and excelling in such fields as agriculture, high-tech, research and development, and cybersecurity. The story of Israel's journey has been full of challenges and hardships, but it is also a story of resilience and innovation, of a dream realized and biblical prophecies fulfilled. The International Christian Embassy Jerusalem salutes the people of Israel as they celebrate 75 years of independence.
Always grateful to our friends at CBN for their helpful reporting.
On this occasion,
ICEJ put in this, of course, forgive me, that they do fantastic work, don't they, Simon? And
incredible work.
It's really encouraging to be able to interact with some of them on a routine basis and to be able to hear of all their initiatives they've been involved in since October the 7th. One of the things that I find fascinating is where Israel's population has gone and is going. At the moment, it's nearing 10 million on this Independence Day. The Times of Israel has a report on Israel's population ticks toward 10 million milestone as it marks 76 years. Of course, you know, the reality is there was upwards to 6 million Jews who perished in the Holocaust. So you can think even how much greater, how much bigger, how much more stable and secure would it have been had those 6 million been alive. The process was already in play. Remember, in 1917, we had the Balfour Declaration. We've already had the foundation, the realities of Zionism on a political level from the 19th century. And even in the centuries leading up to that, there were many even Christians who were saying that this is going to happen. And by God's grace, it did happen, and Israel continues to grow as a nation, expected to surpass the 10 million mark by its 77th anniversary. And now its population grew, the report says, by about 189,000 people. The agency said in an annual estimate released ahead of Israel's 76th Independence Day. And overall, adding 196,000 babies, 37,000 immigrants, which I find very significant, while 60,000 people died since Israel marked 75 years of independence. Those figures then tally up to 173,000, and the Bureau has noted that it also includes those added to the population roll due to family unification, those taken off the rolls for being abroad for more than a year as well. So those individuals could always return.
No, absolutely. Now, what's interesting is that we have Israel's Bureau of National Statistics always release the population figures ahead of Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day. So you're able to look at the kind of population changes in the country. And I suppose the big thing and significant thing is when we looked at the founding of the state back in the 14th of May 1948, you're looking in the region of 700,000 Jewish people, maybe 800,000. But now that figure is almost approaching 10 million. And by next year's Yom Ha'atzmaut, which will be sometime in April or May next year, Israel's population would have reached 10 million. So that's an incredibly significant number of people. Also represents 45% of world Jewry now live in Israel, which is an incredible achievement considering that it's almost reaching 50-50 levels. It's only going to be a few years before there's parity between the number of Jewish people living in Israel and those in the diaspora outside. So it just shows you the incredible success story that Israel is, but also God's faithfulness in what he said he would do through the prophets of bringing the Jewish people home to the four corners of the earth. But there are some interesting significances in this one. I'm just going to read this one out from the Times of Israel. It says that 1.9% population increase over the last year marked a slight drop-off from a growth rate of 2.3% announced a year earlier, with immigration falling by about half from the 79,000 new arrivals the previous year. But also we see there the knock-on effect of October the 7th, because we saw that many Israelis decided to leave Israel after the horrors of October the 7th. And of course, Israel's been in a state of war ever since the end of October of 2003, making it much harder then to make Aliyah to Israel. And so it's not surprising that the numbers of new immigrants is down. But you can guarantee that once this war is over, whether it's against Hamas in the south or Hezbollah in the north, that Israel will have a huge increase in Aliyah, because what we've seen through this war is that Jew hatred has literally spread to the four corners of the earth, and it will be Jew hatred that will bring so many Jewish people back to the homeland of Israel.
Jewish Israelis make up 73.2% of the population, with a number of 7,247,000. That is down from 0.03% from a year ago. And another 2,089,000, that's 21.1% of the population are Arab, with 564,000, 5.7% coming from other minority groups. That's up 0.02%, and that includes non-Arab Christians as well, and those with no registered religion. So some interesting statistics, doubtless impacted by a lot of the unrest that's been exhibited and seen in the past year prior to October the 7th, and especially following the Hamas terror attack. So it will be interesting to see where we're at in the next year as things begin to change and as the outlook going forward becomes a little clearer.
Absolutely, but if we look at the projection of these statistics, so this was the estimated statistics published in 2018, which says the population is expected to reach 11.1 million by 2030, and 13.2 million by 2040. And when Israel reaches its 100th anniversary, that will be in 2048, it's predicted that Israel's population will hit 15.2 million. So we see that Israel is on that trajectory in terms of growth, in terms of its population. Also, what's unique about Israel, unlike probably the Western world, is the fact that in the West, our birth rates are very low. But in Israel, it's very young, and so their birth rates is very high. So it's a very kind of vibrant country, a very vibrant democracy, and it's a very young country. And of course, Israel is that ancient country that's been around for 3,000 years, but we know that it's only a new country in terms of the re-establishment of the State of Israel, as Israel celebrates its 76th anniversary only yesterday.
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has addressed the nation ahead of Independence Day, and the Jewish news syndicate records Netanyahu as having said, "We will defeat our enemies. We have no other choice. We will stand together, and this can only be done together." And at a meeting at the Knesset on Sunday, with those who will light torches at the main stage ceremony on Israel's 76th Independence Day, noted that just as the Jewish state is facing a U.S. arms embargo during the war against Hamas, so too it did when the Arab armies tried to destroy the infant state in 1948. And really what we see, Simon, so often in Israel's history is this cycle repeated and lessons really by other nations not learned. Israel will stand, it will continue to stand, even if it's on its own. And other nations that do not support it will always deal with particular repercussions. The Biden administration announced last week the halt of offensive arms shipments to Israel because after multiple warnings, the IDF has persisted in seeking to achieve its given goal to take Rafah away from Hamas. And its goal from the very beginning of this conflict, Simon, which the U.S. actually initially supported, was to completely eradicate Hamas. Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel has the right to completely overflow and obliterate Hamas. Meanwhile, Blinken, Biden, and company in the U.S. feel that they have some say in the matter and are increasingly speaking simply of destabilizing Hamas and basically teaching Hamas a lesson to some degree. But I think they would be quite happy if Israel said, actually, we're giving this up now.
Yeah, so how much is this down to domestic policy? How much is this down to the impact that the war in Gaza is literally having on Democrats, particularly as we head into the US presidential election in November? Because we know that so many Democrats are progressive and they support the Palestinian cause. So therefore this could have a detrimental impact upon Biden's election chances come November. So that I think plays into the minds of the Democrats, plus also the fact that they are aligning themselves with Israel's enemies. They're supporting the Iranian regime, they're supporting the Qataris, and both nations have their fingerprints on the horrors of October the 7th. And both of those nations are guilty of collaboration with Hamas, committing the worst crimes of massacre against the Jewish people that we've seen since the Holocaust. That was 80 years ago.
Well, in the wake of some of this crisis and the relationship it's having with the U.S., Netanyahu in his speech says, "We will defeat our enemies. We have no other choice. We will stand together. This can only be done together. This is the spirit. We are fighting with everything we have. And I have told our American friends, if necessary, we will fight with our fingernails. We have much more than our fingernails. The main thing we have is what is represented here in this room and which will be presented at the ceremony, the heroism and strength of spirit, the heritage of generations, the understanding that we are in effect fighting for our land, for the future of our existence." And there's a call to continue in achieving this end and expression of gratitude to those who are continuing to lay down their lives, their convenience, and day-to-day enjoyments of life for the sake of the country.
And I think there's this misperception that we need to counter, particularly taken through so much of our kind of mainstream media when it comes to reporting on Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. The fact is that no Israeli soldier wants to be in Gaza. There is not one soldier that wants to step foot in Gaza to actually engage with Hamas. But what's happened after the horrors of October the 7th, Israel's found that she's had no other choice but to destroy Hamas and risk the lives of her soldiers in order to get the hostages home. Now, what was interesting about there was 44 torchbearers yesterday in the Yom Ha'atzmaut memorial service in Jerusalem, representing 12 torches of light, which is very symbolic considering that the nation of Israel is actually built upon the 12 tribes of Israel. So they had the torches for the security forces, a torch for the emergency service, a torch for the rescuers, a torch for the immediate response squads, and a support for the public diplomacy front, together with the torch of the shield and the torch of hope, a torch of medicine and a torch of rehabilitation, the torch of victory and of the spirit, the torch of giving and the torch of the diaspora. And the 12th torch that bears the plight of the hostages. So we see there very, very symbolic meaning, which is very, very important. Let's go back to one of the founding fathers, the story of one of the founding fathers of the modern state of Israel. And that is Theodor Herzl, who came up with the concept of what is known as political Zionism, the political ideology which was transformational in bringing the Jewish people home and creating the modern state of Israel. Let's have a look at this excellent CBN News article looking at the great man himself, Theodor Herzl.
Here at the highest point of Mount Herzl, the grave of modern Israel's most famous founder overlooks Jerusalem and the nation he fought so hard for the Jews to once again possess. Theodor Herzl, a refined Jewish gentleman living in Europe, saw a growing hatred of Jews in the late 1800s and feared the prejudice would never end. That's when he realized God's chosen people needed a safer place to live and sought to take them back to their sacred homeland.
Imagine where the Jewish people were 125 years ago. Broken, lost, wandering, homeless. And this guy with piercing black eyes and a beautiful black beard and a real sense of dignity says, we are a people, we have ties to a particular homeland, and the right to establish a state on that homeland. Zionism. We're going to return to Zion.
In an effort to keep Israel's history alive for new generations, professor and Jerusalem Post commentator Gil Troy has edited the 3-volume Zionist writings of Theodor Herzl.
He saw that at a time when the French were becoming more French and the Italians were becoming more Italian, and there was this amazing thing called America coming together, that it was a moment of nationalism. And in order for the Jews to be accepted, truly respected, they needed their own home. Unfortunately, there was this ugly disease called anti-Semitism, which too many Europeans couldn't get over. It traumatized Herzl. And he said, wait a minute, I'm not going to give in to despair, although he has his dark moments. I'm not going to give up. I'm going to find a way home.
Herzl, a journalist and playwright, wrote of a strong, confident new breed of people establishing this Jewish homeland.
The idea must wing its ways into the most remote, miserable holes where our people dwell. They will awaken from their gloomy torpor. Then, activated, a generation of marvelous Jews will spring into existence.
He lobbied world leaders and assembled Jews from all over to Basel, Switzerland for the first World Zionist Congress. That set off a powerful Zionist movement and led to a prophecy.
August 29th, 1897, he calls together 208 Jews. And by the way, says, meet in formal dress because we're dignified people. We're not losers. And he says, after that Congress, and he puts it in his diaries, but he won't put it in public. He says, nobody's going to believe me, but in Basel we founded the Jewish state. And 50 years from now, people are going to see that I'm right. And indeed, 50 years later, the United Nations on November 29th, 1947, voted to recognize that Zionist idea, that the Jews are a people, they have ties to a particular homeland, and the right to establish a state on that homeland. And a year later, so 51 years later, May 1948, Israel was established. And so he really was a prophet.
Activists began to push for a Jewish homeland, and thousands began moving to what the Bible called the Promised Land. The Jews had been scattered from here some 1,300 years before, and though many believed their ancient homeland to be lost forever, Herzl had faith.
Here's this guy leading this broken, scattered people but he believes in the power of an idea. He believes that ideas are the force that can move history. Ideas are a force that can reunite people.
Although Herzl died in 1904, his influence helped lead to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which endorsed the idea of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Herzl's dream was well on its way to fruition. He'd always believed if you push hard enough, a dream, an idea, could become a reality. He wrote that this particular dream of a Jewish return to Zion must be made real.
It is as old as our people, which has never, even in times of direst misery, ceased to cherish it. The Jewish state is something the world needs, and consequently, it will come into being. And it has.
So an excellent news report courtesy of our friends at CBN, looking at the great man himself, Theodor Herzl, the father of the modern state of Israel. Now, I think his prophecy was incredible. Whether it's 5 years or 50 years' time, that there will be a Jewish state. So, I mean, he was a prophet in his own right. I think the struggle and the weight of the pressure of re-establishing the modern state of Israel took its toll. And sadly he died a relatively young man, but will go down in history as one of the founding fathers of the modern state of Israel. But we can't ignore the fact, can we, the theological dimension to Israel's re-establishment of the modern state of Israel, and how we've seen ancient prophecies from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel literally come alive in our lifetime, which proves the faithfulness of God to his people. But also with that is that the only time that we are living in history where the church coincides with the modern state of Israel. Now, there was only one similar period of history, and that was with the early church. So since the death and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ, and the establishment of the early church was then very Jewish, we did have a nation of Israel, despite the fact it was under Roman occupation. So never have we had a period of world history before where the church and an independent Jewish state are living side by side, which is also shows you how important and prophetic the days are in which we live in.
Yes, very much. And when you consider just that period of time, it's there in the prophets. There's an indicator not only of the people being scattered prior to the first exile, there's even in some of the prophecies made from exile itself and post-exile, this concept of the Jews being scattered across the whole world and at some point being brought back. So this is a very biblical concept. Now, of course, we see that Jesus prophesies, and he himself speaks of how the temple is going to be torn down. There's going to be great havoc and tragedy and sadness that will befall Jerusalem, but there's still an understanding and there's a realization of coming deliverance, to the degree that some years later Paul will speak of, prior to the downfall of Jerusalem, a day and time when all will believe in the Messiah Jesus. And so that was the hope that was there. Even for up until Constantine, there was a significant majority of Jewish followers of Jesus. And it was really with Constantine that we see an attempt all the more to eradicate the symbolism, eradicate a lot of the elements that were distinctly Jewish. Passover, for instance, was something that in name was not supposed to be celebrated. Many continued to observe the Sabbath, as well as commemorating the first day of the week, marking the resurrection. That was banned. Those sorts of things occurred, but throughout there have always been people who were faithful to trust God's promises, not only for some sort of spiritual fulfillment, but for a very genuine, real, physical fulfillment of the return. I think even in the centuries leading up to the past and the formation of the nation state, people like J.C. Ryle, who was the one-time Bishop of Liverpool, Charles Spurgeon, and how they were very clear in their preaching and proclamation that one day there would be a nation called Israel that would be a Jewish state. And that hope has continued, and it's been largely fulfilled.
What's so extraordinary as well, we've got about 2 minutes left, so I'll share this story very, very quickly. But when David Ben-Gurion declared Israel's independence on the 14th of May 1948, they were unsure of what to call the modern state of Israel, as many in the Jewish agency wanted to actually call the modern state of Israel Judea. But they realized that they weren't in control of Judea and Samaria, because obviously this is where the Jews come from, the Jews of Judea. And so therefore the name came up with a vote, and they decided to name it Israel. So it's just an extraordinary how God's prophetic hand has been guiding and directing the nation, particularly as David Ben-Gurion risked the prospect of war by declaring independence, even though he knew that his army was not ready to defeat 5 invading armies, and yet did it anyway. And he was also said very powerfully that to believe in Israel, you need to be a realist. In order to be a realist, you need to believe in miracles. So the fact is that we see miracle after miracle coming. We haven't even touched on the whole aspect of Aliyah, Jewish people making Aliyah to Israel, and the lands blossoming and the desert coming to life again, which is absolutely extraordinary.
Well, the return to Zion is powerful evidence of the truth of Scripture. It is beyond remarkable that we see God, after 2,000 years, fulfill His promise, bringing the people back. That continues to be something in process. And this should create and provoke much, much thought on the part of everyone.
No, absolutely. Reagan, absolute pleasure to do a program with you today. Thank you so much. And want to thank you so much for watching at home. We want to wish Israel happy birthday as the nation of Israel celebrates its 76th year of independence as an independent nation state in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And we need to continue to pray and support the nation of Israel, particularly as Israel's at war against Hamas in Gaza. So thank you for watching this week's edition of Behind the Headlines.